Hello, beautiful people. Today is Monday, February 14th, and you don't have to make it a great day because today is already great. Do you want to know why? Because you're about to spend 5 minutes using word and wisdom to discover, develop, and deploy your unique greatness so that you can change the world. So lean in. This is the Daily Devo. Hello, beautiful people, and welcome back to another episode of the Daily Devo. I'm your host, Losco, and I'm so incredibly excited that you all have joined us once again for another episode of the Daily Devo. Last week, we had an incredible time talking about something that I think is very important in terms of how we approach our purpose. And this week, I want to continue to look at our unique purpose, not just the thing that all of us are called to do, but the thing that you specifically are called to do. I think this is something that we need to understand, and the Bible helps us do that. And one of the most perfect, and he's not perfect, of course, but one of the most perfect examples that we can have in terms of pursuing purpose is Jesus. But along with Jesus in the New Testament is someone who's incredibly impactful, and that is none other than my man, Paul. Paul is responsible for writing over 2/3 of our New Testament. So you have to imagine that this is someone who lived in purpose. But we have to ask ourselves a question as to how did he get started? How did he become the Paul that we know? Well, before we get introduced to Paul, there's someone else I want to introduce you to. Now, when Paul is just getting started in ministry, this is something that happens to him. And this is found in Acts chapter 9, verses 26 and 27. Okay. This is when Paul is going to join the disciples because he was not always with the disciples. So this is what happens when he starts to join the disciples. Acts chapter 9, verse 26 and 27. When he came to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him, not believing that he really was a disciple. But Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles. He told them how Saul on his journey had seen the Lord, and that the Lord had spoken to him, and how in Damascus he had preached fearlessly in the name of Jesus. Now, if you were listening to that last verse 27, you would have heard a name that you might know but aren't really familiar with, and that's Saul. Now, for those of you who don't know, before you have Paul, you have to understand who Saul was. Because when you understand who Saul was, you'll understand why the disciples were afraid of him. Now, who is Saul? Saul was someone who was a religious, I almost used a word that I think is probably a little inappropriate. But he was a fanatic. He was a Pharisee. He was someone who was responsible for the Jewish law and making sure that it was followed to the T. He knew the law like the back of his hand, and anyone who opposed the law, he persecuted them. Now, some of you might have heard about how early Christians were persecuted. They were people who were put to death in many cases as a result, not just of political pressure, but also religious pressure. And Paul, formerly known as Saul, would have been someone who was carrying out these kinds of forms of injustice against the Christians. So Saul was a bad man. He would go from place to place persecuting Christians. And what we're going to discover through this narrative of Saul this week is how Saul pursues purpose and becomes Paul. He has a transformative moment. He begins to see who he really is, and he has to encounter Jesus in order to do that. So when we look at the life of Saul and how Saul's purpose becomes clear to Saul, and then he becomes Paul, We have to see what happens to him so that we can look at ourselves. The Bible is not just for us to look at stories from others and say that that was great for them, but the Bible is there and the stories are there to help us look at ourselves. The Bible turns a mirror back to us to say, how are we coming in agreement with who God has called us to be on this earth? So let's strap in this week. We're going to talk about purpose. We're going to talk about your unique purpose by looking at the life of someone who had a radical shift. We talked about divine disruptions earlier in the season, but we're going to talk about that, what that's going to look like for you, or what it might look like for you by looking at the life of Paul. I can't wait for it because this is going to be really exciting. But before tomorrow hits, I just want you to ask yourself this question. Who were you formerly known as? What things might you have been known for that you feel like God is pulling you away from? And when you begin to discover that, you're going to begin to discover that you are entering into a season where there will be a reintroduction of you. You aren't going to be known as you were known before. There's going to be a new name applied to your life. There's going to be a new way of being applied to your life. You are not going to be the same after you learn who you are and begin to pursue your purpose. So let's lean in this week. I can't wait to see you all again in another episode tomorrow. Before tomorrow hits, share the Daily Devo with someone. I'll see you all tomorrow. Have a good day.